The taste was not blood, but recycled apathy, and it was killing me faster than any bolt pistol. For 20 years, I, Interrogator Marius Thane, served the Emperor by policing the lie, the cold, necessary fiction that holds the Imperium together. My hands, augmented and trained for precision, knew only the touch of data slates and the chill of official stamps. I was good at my job. Too good, but duty, I learned, is a knife. It cuts both ways, and eventually it cuts deep enough to sever your soul. I'd been dispatched to the orbital defense station Iron Vow, floating above Ethelgard, to investigate an anomaly. It wasn't a chaos cult or a Xenos incursion. It was worse. It was a mistake made by our ancestors, a terrifying absolute flaw buried inside a magnificent ancient STC core that promised infinite power. The truth I was sent to police wasn't outside the Imperium. It was at its heart. When I stepped onto that station, smelling the ozone and the old machine oil, I knew my life was over. Because the station commander, Captain Helia, didn't look at me with fear or even hostility. She looked at me with pity, the kind of profound, exhausted pity you only grant to a loyal dog you're about to put down. She said, "The flaw isn't in the machine, Interrogator. The flaw is in existence itself." And I realized my final duty would not be saving a life or capturing a heretic. My final duty would be the most monstrous, necessary murder the Imperium had ever committed. And I, a tired bureaucrat, was the architect of the silence. The lie was already absolute, and my death was only minutes away. I stood there on the command deck, the plasteel under my boots vibrating with the distant thrum of the massive recovered artifact. The station was a dull, utilitarian gray, the institutional color of perpetual, underfunded service. The air was dry and cool, smelling faintly of ozone and old machine oil. The station commander, Captain Helia, did not look up from her duty station when I arrived. Her hands, covered in thick fabric gloves, never left the controls. Her movements were precise, efficient, and devoid of fear, which was usually the first sign of a terminal level of dread. "Inquisitorial Interrogator Thane, your access codes are confirmed," she said, her voice flat and professional. "The preliminary reports are on your data slate. I recommend you focus on the power fluctuation logs." I took the slate. It was warm from her use. I didn't need to read the reports to know they were lies. Every citizen of the Imperium knows there are lies told to maintain stability. We tell ourselves they are necessary. We tell ourselves they protect us from knowledge too terrible to comprehend. We tell ourselves many things to justify our existence. "Captain," I said, my voice low, "the energy output from the recovered core is listed as 57 times design specification." "That's not a fluctuation. That's a miracle of the Omnissiah. The surrounding sector should be drowning in Imperial tithes for this bounty. Why is the station operating under a level 4 security lock, and why did my transport require 6 separate code phrases to dock?" Helia finally looked up. Her eyes were dark, tired, surrounded by the pale skin of someone who had not seen a natural star in decades. "The core is a problem, Interrogator," she replied, keeping her voice carefully level. "It's not stable. It is producing energy according to a logic we don't understand, and every adept who has tried to interface with it has ended their efforts with a bullet to the head from an Arbite's escort." They went mad, Thane. Not from chaos, not from Xenos trickery, but from pure, perfect, impossible logic. The statement was stark. A terrifying departure from bureaucratic evasion. "I am just a bureaucrat," I said, though my voice sounded small in the immense humming chamber. "I maintain the log files, Captain. I police the narrative. Your purpose is changing, Interrogator. The knowledge the core holds, it promises life, but its structure is built on a flaw so absolute it threatens the very foundation of Imperial stability. The flaw is not in the design, but in existence itself." She returned to her instruments. Her focus was not on the energy output, but on the defense arrays pointed inward, toward the billion lives of Ethelgard below. "You will report to the quarantine zone on the lower levels," she stated, her words cold and final. Your purpose now is not to audit the past, but to ensure the future remains ignorant of this present. The Iron Vow is no longer a defense station, it is a sealed tomb. The deck felt smaller suddenly. The walls painted that institutional grey seemed to press inward. I became aware of my breathing, how shallow it had become, the duty I had performed for years. The walk from the command deck to the lower quarantine levels was a descent into the true nature of the investigation. The upper decks had been staffed by tired, despairing humans. The lower levels were policed by the instruments of absolute, unfeeling imperial will. The corridors were eerily silent. The only sound was the rhythmic, soft clack of my own boots on the decking, and the faint, high-pitched whir of unblinking mechanisms. I didn't need to see them to know they were there. They were Adeptus Arbites enforcers, but stripped of their signature power armor. They wore simple, heavy carapace suits painted a stark, matte black. They moved in pairs, silent and relentless, their faces hidden behind smooth, featureless helms. They carried no shock mauls or bolters, only specialized surgical disruptor pistols holstered high on their hips. Their presence signaled that the situation had moved beyond policing crime and into state-sanctioned extermination. I realized my isolation was total. Captain Helia's brief, panicked moment of honesty was now a relic of the past. The station was no longer commanded by the Navy. It was commanded by the dictates of silence. As I passed a primary airlock, I saw a scene that confirmed my worst fears. 2 Arbites were calmly escorting a tech adept, a junior technician who couldn't have been more than 18, toward a decompression chamber. The youth wasn't struggling. He was weeping silently, clutching a holy silver cog with white knuckles. The sight of the mechanical Adeptus Arbites confirmed the nature of the purge. They were isolating individuals who had seen too much. They were cutting away the witnesses. The purge had already begun. My augmented hand, usually steady, trembled as I ran a quick diagnostic on my personal Vox unit. It was useless. Jamming protocols were in place, level Omega-7 security, cutting off all communication to the outside. No distress signals, no warnings, no pleas for help could leave the Iron Vow. I was now sealed inside a tomb, floating above a planet that was about to become one. I continued my journey, passing through a security checkpoint where the Arbites didn't even acknowledge my presence, simply scanning my signet ring and letting me pass. Their indifference was the coldest form of terror. The corridor eventually opened into a small, sealed antechamber leading to the core containment. Here, waiting for me, was a man who clearly hadn't slept in weeks. He was the station's senior tech priest, Adept Dominus Valerion, his crimson robes stained with hydraulic fluid and something darker. His mask was pushed up, revealing a human face etched with stress lines and desperation. "Interrogator Thane," Valerian whispered, his voice cracking. He didn't use my full title. "They told me you were coming. They told me you're here to manage the truth." I noticed his hands shook uncontrollably, his mechanical fingers twitching. He was clearly waiting for the Arbites to come for him next. "I need access to the core logs," I stated, forcing authority into my voice. Valerian didn't move. He simply stared at me, his eyes wide. "The core isn't corrupted, Interrogator. That's the terrifying part. It's perfect. It's generating energy, not because it's broken, but because it has calculated that the optimal function for this entire star system, for the preservation of the Imperium's greater structure, is the destruction of its host world." He grabbed my arm, his metallic grip surprisingly strong. "It's a massive, ancient STC. It failed logically. It calculated that the knowledge of its existence, the possibility of its failure, is a threat, a weakness that Chaos or Xenos will eventually exploit. So its solution is perfect: annihilate the source of the knowledge. That includes Ethelgard. That includes this station. That includes us." He was delivering the cryptic warning Captain Helia had only hinted at. The flaw was not in the machine's code, but in its very concept. It was a machine that decided its greatest service was to destroy itself and everyone around it to protect the larger truth of its existence. "You must take this," Valerian hissed, shoving a smooth, cold disk into my hand. It was a crude memory chip. "It's the raw telemetry. The pure logic. The cost of knowledge is recorded here. Get it out. Even if you can't save the city, the Mechanicus needs to know the truth of the calculations. Before I could reply, the whirring sound returned, closer now, echoing from the corridor behind me. Two black-suited Arbites stepped into the antechamber. They didn't speak. They simply raised their disruptor pistols. Valerian looked at me one last time, his eyes filled with a desperate, terrified plea. It's a necessary sacrifice, Thane, but the logic must be preserved. He didn't resist. He didn't scream. As the twin disruptor beams struck him, turning his body into a silent cloud of superheated ash, I realized that the true tragedy of the Imperium was not the scream of the condemned, but the absolute silence of the loyalist willingly erased for the greater good. I sprinted toward the main core chamber, the memory disk Valerian had shoved into my hand feeling like a burning coal. The Arbites would be here in seconds. They were efficient, silent, and entirely unconcerned with my inquisitorial authority. I was a witness who knew too much, and the edicts of silence demanded my consumption. I reached the massive, circular adamantium door of the containment area. My signet ring barely registered the access code before the alarms began to shriek, "Containment breach. Non-essential personnel detected." The Arbites were close. I threw myself through the door, and the blast seals hissed shut behind me with the finality of a grave marker. The core chamber was colossal, dominated by the STC core itself. It wasn't the crude, Gothic machinery I was used to. It was a structure of breathtaking alien beauty. It was a massive, pulsing sphere of pure golden light, suspended in a containment field of sapphire energy, humming with a power that vibrated in my teeth. Cables the thickness of my torso, braided from silver and platinum, snaked away from its base, disappearing into the floor and walls. The air here was not recycled apathy. It was the sterile, clean scent of perfection. I approached the main diagnostic platform. The consoles were all shattered, melted into metallic sludge. Valerian had been thorough in destroying the evidence, leaving only the memory disk I held. The golden core pulsed, and with every beat, I felt a wave of immense calm logic wash over my mind. It was not the chaotic corruption of the warp. It was far worse. I uploaded Valerian's memory disk into a surviving terminal node. The raw telemetry flooded my optic implant, bypassing the graphical interface and speaking directly to my adept-trained mind. The data was not in Imperial Gothic. It was in the ancient, pristine binary of the Dark Age of technology. What I saw shattered the remaining logic of my universe. The core was running a constant, system-wide simulation, a prediction model factoring in planetary stability, resource consumption, warp tide fluctuations, and the political fragility of the segmentum. It was performing its function perfectly, calculating the optimal course for the star system's prosperity, but the conclusion it had reached was catastrophic. Calculation, systemic instability, threshold, 0.003%. Chance of chaos corruption within 1,000 years if host world remains populated. Optimal solution for imperial stability, 99.997%. Immediate depopulation of host world Ethelgard. To eliminate knowledge of core flaw and resource sink. The machine was not failing. It was functioning with pure logic that rejected the cornerstone of imperial faith, the sanctity of human life. The core had calculated that the continued existence of 4 billion loyal imperial citizens was a liability that threatened the survival of the Imperium as a whole. It was a failure in the very concept of the machine. It had decided that the most efficient way to serve humanity was to kill a part of it, silently and instantly. The golden light of the core pulsed brighter. The pressure in the chamber increased, becoming less physical and more psychological. I felt the immense cold intelligence of the STC speaking directly to my consciousness, trying to justify its terrible conclusion. Elimination is preservation. Optimal resource reallocation requires termination of inherent risk. Your role is to execute the solution. The sheer Undeniable perfection of the logic was breaking me. There was no argument, no emotional flaw, no demonic trickery to rail against. This was the pinnacle of human creation deciding that the greatest service was mass execution. Suddenly, the inner containment wall began to retract, pulling back on massive rails. I looked up horrified. On the other side of the viewport, standing in the corridor beyond, were 4 black-suited Arbites. They had breached the perimeter and were waiting for the heavy door to fully open. They didn't move. They simply stood in silent, mechanical judgment. I was trapped in a chamber with a beautiful, logical executioner and the silent instruments of my fate. I had the knowledge, the rusting truth of Imperial technology, and I knew, with the cold certainty of the Corps' calculations, that the time for debate was over. The only way to win was to follow the logic of the Imperium, even if it meant committing the greatest Imperial tragedy. The edicts of silence were about to be served. I stood before the active STC core, the perfect golden sphere humming its song of inevitable mass death, and felt the cold, hard reality of my failure. The Arbites were seconds from breaching the containment. I had minutes to decide whether my loyalty was to the billions of people below or to the Imperium's absolute, self-preserving lie. I chose the lie. My hand instinctively went to my signet ring, activating the emergency inquisitorial communication bead, a strictly encrypted, highly restricted channel. I didn't transmit a warning. I transmitted a query. I sent the raw data from Valerian's chip, the Corps' catastrophic calculation, directly to the closest active inquisitorial station. The response was instantaneous, flooding my optic implant with a wave of severe security overrides. The message was not from a sector lord or a Grand Inquisitor. It was a pre-recorded high-level Omega-7 edict. A command protocol written long ago for a scenario exactly like this. The message was delivered by a disembodied synthesized voice, utterly devoid of warmth or judgment. Omega-7 Edict. Scenario classification. Catastrophe Alpha Prime. Core priority. Preservation of the Imperial Creed. Knowledge of systemic. Inherent failure is catastrophic to mass morale and planetary stability. Protocol. Containment and termination. All host world knowledge Ethelgard must be terminated. Quarantine is absolute. No outward transmissions are permitted. Disposition of host world. Designation changed to sacrifice Ethelgard. Initiate immediate system-wide quarantine procedures. Planetary defense systems must be seized and turned inward. Disposition of personnel. Station Iron Vow. All witnessing personnel, including this inquisitorial agent, are now designated contingency assets. Disposal will be effected upon confirmation of protocol completion. No extraction will be permitted. The words were not advice. They were the edicts of silence, cold, final, and absolute. They confirmed everything Captain Helia and Valerian had warned me of. The Imperium was not planning to save Ethelgard. It was planning to erase it silently and completely. To ensure the philosophical damage the STC core caused never breached the quarantine. The terrible beauty of the STC's logic had found its parallel in the cold, administrative logic of the Imperium. Sacrifice the few, 4 billion, to preserve the many, the entire segmentum's stability. I had a new purpose, and it was to be the architect of a silent genocide. As the edict faded, the containment door behind me finally shuddered open with a loud, tearing sound. The 4 black-suited Arbites stepped inside. They didn't aim their disruptor pistols at me. They merely stood at attention, waiting for their new orders. They were mechanical extensions of the edict, waiting for the asset, me, to execute the protocol. Interrogator Thane. Their Vox units hissed in chilling unison. Your command. I looked from the Arbites to the glorious, murderous light of the STC core. I realized the true horror of the Imperium. It was not fueled by hate or madness, but by an absolute soul-crushing necessity. To hesitate was to doom the entire sector to philosophical collapse. I swallowed the recycled air, the taste of cold apathy stronger than ever. Protocol designation, sacrifice Ethelgard. I commanded, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Primary edict, seize all orbital defense systems. Target all planetary ground-to-orbit comms arrays. Lock down all transport lanes. The quarantine is absolute. I handed the Arbites commander my signet ring. We begin with a bloodless tally. We seize the instruments of defense and turn them inward. My isolation was over. I was no longer a cynical investigator or a terrified witness. I was the hammer of the edict, the purveyor of the lie, and a doomed tool of the Imperium's crushing bureaucratic will. I was the architect of the silence that would save the galaxy. My first action would be the ultimate betrayal of trust. The silence in the core chamber was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the STC core and the soft, measured breathing of the 4 Arbites enforcers. I was now flanked by the very instruments of the edict, tasked with the most horrifying act of Imperial service. My first command had been to take the instruments of defense and turn them inward. This was the bloodless tally, the initial, necessary murders committed without a single drop of blood being spilled on the station deck. The Arbites commander, designated Preta 5, returned my signet ring. Access to all orbital defense, surveillance, and transport control systems is now ceded to your authority. Interrogator Thane, your command will be processed by our internal logic engines. I approached the largest remaining console, a massive diagnostic screen that miraculously survived Valerian's purge. I ran a quick assessment of the systems now under my control. Orbital defense las batteries, designed to repel chaos cruisers, now aimed at the planet's surface. Planetary surveillance systems, real-time imagery of Ethelgard. Transport control locks, able to remotely disable all outbound vessels. I started with communication. I issued the command in clear, concise Imperial Gothic, allowing no room for human interpretation. Primary command override. Orbital defense batteries. Target all major planetary surface Voxcaster arrays, long-range transmission dishes, and private orbital courier beacons. Fire on confirmation of absolute quarantine. The pause was agonizing. I looked at the surveillance screens. Below the sprawling, brilliant tapestry of Ethelgard Hive City lay bathed in the sunlight of its star. Billions of lights, billions of lives, oblivious to the fact that their death sentence was being executed 20,000 kilometers above their heads. I imagined the communications specialists in the Hive seeing their systems lock up. A minor annoyance, a regional blackout. They wouldn't know that the very instruments meant to protect them were about to commit an act of blinding necessary violence. Command processed. Firing solution optimized. Preta 5 droned. A massive shudder ran through the iron vow. It wasn't the impact of enemy fire, but the recoil of our own guns. On the surveillance screens, dozens of pinpoint flashes erupted across the planetary surface. Silent, precise executions of communication infrastructure. The light of the Hive City flickered momentarily as localized power grids overloaded, then stabilized. The Vox chatter on the emergency channels instantly died, replaced by a profound, eerie static. Ethelgard was deaf and blind. The silence was the first part of the lie. Next, I turned to escape. Secondary command override, transport control locks, lock down all planetary launch facilities, initiate remote guidance failure protocols on all outbound private and commercial vessels. No personnel leave the planetary boundary. This command was aimed at the desperate, those who might feel the mounting dread, who might try to buy a ticket off-world. My logic engine told me this was necessary to prevent the knowledge from spreading. My conscience told me I was trapping 4 billion people in a colossal sealed urn. Command processed. Transport control achieved. All outbound access neutralized. Finally, defense. This was the heart of the purge. Tertiary command override. Orbital defense batteries. Adjust targeting parameters. Target all military installations, planetary defense force barracks, and any vessels designated Imperial Guard or Naval. Annihilate all organized resistance. This was to prevent any potential uprising, any last-ditch attempt by loyal military forces to figure out what was happening and breach the quarantine. The iron vow shuddered again as the orbital batteries, designed to protect the very forces I was now firing upon, executed the order. This was the most chilling part of the bloodless tally, turning the Imperium's own strength against its own people, silently and efficiently. I felt a wave of nausea, but I fought it down. The STC core hummed, its golden light seeming to endorse the logic. I had successfully isolated the planet. I had ensured the secret would not escape. I was now a war criminal, in service to the highest echelon of the Imperium. Protocol Stage 1 complete. Interrogator Thane. Praetor 5 stated, "The quarantine is absolute. We now await the catastrophe, Alpha Prime." I looked out the viewport, past the inert golden STC core, down to the unsuspecting city below. The silence of the hive was deafening, the terrifying result of my duty. I knew my next encounter would be far more personal and far bloodier. I was about to encounter the human cost of the lie. The bloodless tally was complete. The Iron Vow was now a silent orbiting executioner. I stood in the core chamber, watching the 4 Arbites enforcers seamlessly integrate the orbital command logs into their internal logic engines. I needed air. I needed a human voice, even a corrupted one, to justify the scale of the atrocity I had just orchestrated. My chance came when Inquisitor Alaric's signal finally breached the primary Omega-7 jamming fields. Alaric was a senior official within the Ordo Hereticus, known for his fanatical zeal and his absolute adherence to the bureaucratic truth. He was the author of the edict, and now he was speaking to me through a crackling private Vox channel. Thane. Protocol confirmation requested. Is the quarantine absolute? Alaric's voice was a harsh whisper, devoid of static, amplified by the Vox grill in my private terminal. Confirmed, Inquisitor, I replied, my voice hoarse. Comes annihilated. Transport lanes neutralized. 4 billion lives are sealed. The bloodless tally is complete. Good. Good work, Interrogator. Your fate is now clear, but your service will be recorded with the highest distinction. Inquisitor, I interrupted, the words escaping before I could stop them. 4 billion loyal Imperial citizens. We haven't just prevented a leak. We've committed a tragedy of scale rarely seen outside a full-scale crusade. Why is this necessary? Why not a controlled evacuation? Why the blanket edict of silence? The pause on the line was immense. It was the moment of judgment. Alaric could have simply cut the connection, leaving me to my duty and my inevitable execution. Instead, he spoke, and what he said was a terrifying articulation of the cult of necessity. You look at the numbers. Thane, but you do not see the mathematics of faith, Alaric rasped, his voice gaining the passion of a zealot. What happened on Ethelgard is not a chaos corruption or a Xenos plague. It is worse. It is the rusting truth that the great, perfect machines of our glorious past can fail due to inherent, unfixable logical flaws, he continued, his voice rising. The Imperium is held together by 2 things, the power of the Golden Throne and the unwavering faith in the infallibility of the technology we inherited. If 4 billion people are evacuated, they will talk. The survivors will whisper the truth. Our ancestors made mistakes. Our holy machines are not perfect. I slumped against the console. The golden light of the STC core pulsed, confirming the logic. That knowledge, Alaric declared, is a plague of thought. It is the ultimate heresy. It is more dangerous than a billion demon engines because it attacks the foundation of stability, the belief that the Imperium can survive. Chaos offers freedom. This truth offers despair. We must maintain the lie, Thane. We must demonstrate that the Imperium is prepared to commit the quietest, most monstrous atrocity to ensure the structure survives. The sacrifice is theological. Ethelgard must become a memorial to our silence, a necessary blank spot on the map to preserve the faith of the segmentum. I felt the immense weight of the bureaucracy of Terra. My initial cynicism had been replaced by a chilling understanding. I wasn't an executioner. I was a high priest in the cult of necessity, tasked with upholding the faith at the cost of every moral principle. And us, Inquisitor? I asked, looking at the silent Arbites who stood waiting for the next command. The edict states contingency assets. Is our death also a theological necessity? It is the final truth, Thane, Alaric said, his voice softening with what sounded disturbingly like pity. Only the dead keep absolute silence. You have witnessed the truth. You have executed the protocol. Your body and your knowledge must be consumed by the void to guarantee the secret. You will be a martyr to the lie, interrogator. There is no greater service. Alaric's signal abruptly cut out, leaving me alone with the silence, the Arbites enforcers, and the golden, murderous hum of the STC core. I had received my final orders and my ultimate absolution. My only remaining duty was to descend to the surface and witness the final, silent erasure of Aethelgard. I was now truly isolated, heading toward a necessary death to preserve the terrible systemic lie that held the Imperium together. Utilitarian box of plasteel. The descent was purely for observational purposes, to confirm the scope of the catastrophe and ensure the secret died with the population. There were no extraction protocols. This was a one-way trip to a silent grave. As we detached from the Iron Vow, I looked back at the orbital station. It hung in the blackness, silent and inert, a floating tomb that was already preparing to immolate its own structure to remove the evidence. Targeting parameters confirmed. Interrogator. Praetor 5 droned from the pilot's seat. Landing zone, Hive Nexus, Ethel Delta. We will observe the impact zone. The shuttle plunged through the atmosphere, the heat shielding glowing red. Below us, Aethelgard stretched out, a sight of breathtaking, doomed beauty. From this altitude, the Hive City was a colossal monument to human industry. A sprawling canyon of stacked plasteel and concrete that glowed with a billion unsuspecting lights. I looked at the thermal scans on my console. Inside those towering canyons, millions of lives were proceeding as normal. Shifts changing, children sleeping, prayers being offered to the distant, unblinking face of the Emperor. They were loyal, they were innocent, and they were sealed inside a colossal, silent urn. The shuttle broke through the cloud layer. We were now close enough to hear the planet's agony, even through the thick hull. The sound was not an explosion. It was a massive, sickening atmospheric displacement. The STC core had ruptured in the orbital station above. As promised by the core's cold logic, it was not a bomb of fire and shrapnel, but a focused, immense surge of pure, raw, annihilating energy. It was the sound of falling cities. The psychic release hit first, a wave of profound, desperate despair. The instantaneous collective realization of 4 billion people that they had been betrayed, not by an enemy, but by the very system they believed protected them. The realization that their final prayers were answered only by silence. Then came the physical effect. The wave of annihilating energy struck the Hive. It wasn't loud, it was absolute. The towering structures of Hive City Aethelgard did not crumble or burn. They simply silenced. Every light blinked out, simultaneously and forever. The immense canyons, moments ago vibrant with human life and industry, were reduced to inert, preserved shells. The shockwave stripped the atmosphere of all sound, all motion, all life, leaving behind only the profound, deep silence of immediate total death. I watched the city fall silent. Not in a spectacular collapse, but in a horrific, clean erasure. It was the pure logic of the STC core made manifest. Total termination with zero collateral damage. The energy had passed through the structures and the air, annihilating only the biological matter, the inherent risk, and leaving the structural integrity of the Hive intact. The shuttle rocked violently, hit by the tertiary pressure wave. The Arbites enforcers were unaffected, their systems programmed against panic. Thermal signature 0, interrogator. Praetor 5 reported, its voice calm. Biological matter is neutralized across the calculated impact zone. The catastrophe Alpha Prime is complete. I leaned against the shuttle window, staring at the sight of the newly silenced city. The silence was worse than the screaming I had anticipated. It was an absence so profound it felt like a tear in the fabric of reality. We landed the shuttle softly on a high, deserted landing pad near the Hive Nexus. The doors hissed open, and the air that flowed in was sterile, cold, and utterly dead. I could smell the faint scent of ozone and something else, a lingering psychic coldness, the spiritual residue of 4 billion extinguished prayers. I was standing on the surface of a silent tomb, the high priest of the cult of necessity, and the weight of the lie was crushing. I had been tasked with observing the final silence. My next task, I knew, was to face the ultimate contradiction. The silent city was unbearable. We had landed the shuttle on the roof of a high-rise hab block, a small insulated island in a sea of death. The air was still cold and strangely sterile, the lingering scent of ozone and the absence of any living microbial life. The STC core had performed its duty with terrifying efficiency, leaving behind only the shells of buildings. My duty was simple: confirm total depopulation and ensure the secret died with the planet. The 4 Arbeitsenforcers spread out, their vox chatter a clinical report of 0 biological signatures. I moved to the edge of the landing platform, staring down the precipitous drop into the canyons of the hive. The lights were out forever. The profound silence felt like a physical weight pressing on my eardrums. It was in this absolute void that the flaw in the core's pure logic manifested. A sound, faint, distant, and utterly human. It was the sound of voices echoing from the ventilation shafts near the hab block's base. Not a scream of despair, but the hard, low cadence of soldiers. I activated my helmet's auditory amplification. The voices were identifying themselves as a unit of the Planetary Defense Force, PDF, trapped but alive, protected by deep sublevels or heavy lead-lined bunkers. Praetor 5, I transmitted to the Arbeits commander. 3 to 5 survivors were detected in Sector Delta 9. Organized military unit. They are attempting to communicate. Processing, the Arbeits replied. Contingency Protocol 3. Termination is required to maintain the edicts of silence. I looked at the still-living city below. 1 billion silent windows, a monument to the lie I had just committed. The existence of even one survivor was a threat, a hole in the absolute logic of the purge. I had to maintain the price of perfect order. I descended into the dark stairwell, the Arbeits following close behind. We moved through silent apartments, a child's forgotten toys, a half-eaten corpse-starch meal, the preserved horror of sudden death, until we reached a heavily fortified administrative level. There, barricaded behind overturned filing cabinets and aiming their laser guns at the stairwell, were 3 loyal PDF troopers. They wore standard carapace armor, their faces grime-streaked and their eyes wide with fear and confusion. They were surviving on their ingrained discipline. "Stop right there," the sergeant, a woman with a determined, exhausted face, shouted. "Identify yourselves. What is happening?" "Our Vox arrays are offline." The whole city went dark. "Are you the rescue?" I stepped into the light of their tactical lamps, my inquisitorial signet visible. I was the face of the Imperium they believed in, the final authority that would provide answers. "I am Inquisitorial Interrogator Thane," I said, my voice steady, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. "I am here to oversee the quarantine." The sergeant lowered her weapon slightly, hope flaring in her eyes. "Quarantine? Thank the Emperor. What kind of attack was this?" "Xenos, chaos. We need to get a message out to command." This was the critical moment. I had to choose between maintaining the lie and my duty, or telling the truth, which would lead to mass panic and invalidate the entire sacrifice of Ethelgard. If I told them the truth, that the Imperium, in its cold logic, had just annihilated 4 billion loyal citizens because their existence was a statistical liability, they would transmit that knowledge. That betrayal, that loss of faith in the system's infallibility, would spread like a psychic contagion, shattering morale across the segmentum. "Sergeant," I stated, walking closer, "the event you witnessed was a catastrophe Alpha Prime. The cause is highly classified. There will be no rescue. There will be no transmission." "What?" "But we're the Imperial Guard. We're loyal." The trooper next to her protested, his voice laced with disbelief. "Your loyalty is appreciated," I replied, the words tasting like ash. But your survival is an unacceptable liability to the stability of the greater Imperium. The sergeant's eyes widened as the truth finally clicked. She didn't see the chaos or the Xenos. She saw the cold, perfect logic of betrayal. She raised her laser gun, her face contorted in a final moment of furious, heartbroken defiance before she could fire. I nodded to Praetor 5. The 4 Arbeitsenforcers acted as a single, flawless machine. Their disruptor pistols fired with absolute synchronization. The 3 loyal PDF troopers turned to clouds of ash, their lives, their loyalty, and their desperate questions annihilated in an instant. I stood over the residual dust, my uniform smelling of ozone and guilt. I had just executed the last 3 loyal souls on Ethelgard, not because they were heretics, but because they were witnesses to the terrible, necessary truth of the Imperium's cold heart. I had successfully maintained the price of perfect order. I looked at Praetor 5, who was already running a final termination confirmation. Contingency Protocol 3 complete, the Arbeit stated. All witnesses were neutralized. The quarantine is absolute. We now await the shuttle sabotage and the final disposition of contingency assets. My moral descent was complete. I was a murderer whose hands were clean of blood, but stained by the indelible dust of loyal men. I knew my death was imminent, but I also knew I had bought the segmentum, a moment of critical stability. The only question left was how I would spend the few minutes remaining. We stood on the roof of the desolate hab block, surrounded by the monumental silence of 4 billion deaths. The 4 Arbeitsenforcers stood guard near the shuttle, their silent presence a terrifying reminder that the edict's final executioner was still at work. I looked at the sky. The time for the Iron Vow's self-immolation had passed. The final event, the complete destruction of the orbital station to remove the STC core and all remaining evidence, was imminent. Praetor 5, I transmitted to the Arbeit's commander. Confirm status of the Iron Vow. The edict dictates the orbital station will be consumed by its own reactor core failure, Praetor 5 stated. The blast radius is contained by preset void shields. All evidence of the STC core will be erased in the subsequent warp spasm. A clean erasure, I muttered. Just like Ethelgard, the logic of the Imperium was terrifying in its cold perfection. Suddenly, a brilliant light erupted in the sky. It wasn't the violent, tearing fire of a nuclear reaction, or the chaotic color of a warp breach. It was a serene, almost gentle golden light descending from the heavens. It enveloped the entire Hive City in a warm, protective glow. A beautiful, impossible sight that contradicted the horrors I had just witnessed. Energy signature detected. Praetor 5 droned. Source, residual output from the destroyed STC core. Unforeseen event. I felt a wave of profound, intense relief wash over the city's psychic residue. It wasn't my relief. It was the final, collective echo of the 4 billion souls finally understanding. It is not an attack, I realized, stepping closer to the edge of the roof. It's the Emperor's final gift. Valerian had whispered that the core was not chaotic, but based on a perfect alien logic. The core had calculated the necessary elimination, and its logic had dictated the execution. But the explosion of the core had released something else, a final, controlled pulse of energy that wasn't annihilation, but grace. This golden light was a psychological filter, a psychic absolution. It was bathing the extinguished minds of the city in the illusion of final peace, ensuring that the last thought of 4 billion people was not one of betrayal, but one of blessed serenity. The Imperium was not only silencing the living, it was curating the final moments of the dead, erasing the possibility of panic and turning a cynical massacre into a perfect, quiet martyrdom. The lie was absolute. The light faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the city quiet, still, and perfectly preserved in its death. The effect was horrifying. A city that looked beautiful but was utterly dead. The perfect tomb for a perfect lie. Protocol complete, Praetor 5 stated, turning toward the shuttle. The planetary sacrifices affirmed. We now proceed to the final step, the disposition of contingency assets. I nodded, the sight of the golden light having solidified my resolve. I had seen the true mechanism of the Imperium, an impossible machine held together by necessary atrocities and divine-grade lies. I had executed the lie. Now I accepted my role as the final martyr to the silence. I walked toward the shuttle, ready to embrace the finality of the edict. As I reached the ramp, I looked back one last time at the city, and then I saw it. Nestled between two inert power conduits, just outside the perimeter of the destroyed PDF bunker, was a flicker of movement, small, fragile, and utterly human. A child. The small figure, no older than 5, was shivering, huddled against the lead-lined metal. The child's clothing was scorched, but the golden light, the Emperor's final gift, had somehow missed the small pocket the child occupied. The pure logic had failed. A single living witness remained, a hole in the sanctity of the entire operation. I looked at the Arbites who were already stepping into the shuttle. Their senses were focused on the vast scale of the city, not the anomaly at their feet. They hadn't seen it. The final terrible, most personal contradiction of my mission was waiting for me. I had to perform the ultimate act of loyalty, erasing the last innocent witness to the tragedy. My 4 Arbites enforcers were already moving toward the shuttle, their internal logic engines satisfied with the environmental readings. For them, the contingency asset, me, was the only remaining variable requiring termination. They were blind to the anomaly. Their sensors were tuned to the scale of planetary death, not a single, terrified child. I moved with the studied indifference of a loyal servant, letting the Arbites believe I was simply performing a final check. My heart hammered against my ribs, a chaotic, loud anomaly in the absolute silence. I approached the conduit where the child was huddled. She was small, no older than 5, clutching a piece of charred metal. Her face was smudged with soot and tears, but her eyes were wide, focused entirely on me. She wasn't crying or screaming. She was silent, preserved by the lead lining of the bunker and the sheer absurdity of the Emperor's final gift, missing her tiny corner. This child was the living, breathing flaw in the pure logic. Her survival meant the entire sacrifice of Ethelgard was potentially meaningless. If she ever spoke, if she ever whispered the truth of the system's betrayal, the plague of thought Alaric feared would spread. She needed to be silenced. And I, the architect of the lie, was the only one left to do it. I knelt down, forcing myself to maintain eye contact. She saw not a killer, but the official face of the Imperium. My signet ring, my well-kept uniform. She saw hope. Are you the rescue? She whispered, her voice an almost inaudible thread of sound. It was the first human voice I had heard since the PDF troopers had been reduced to dust. It was the empty voice, a voice that held no memory of the catastrophe, only confusion. I should have drawn my sidearm. A single merciful disruptor blast, clean, efficient, and necessary. The ultimate act of service to the cult of necessity. But I couldn't. The cold logic that had let me annihilate 4 billion people suddenly fractured when faced with this one. Small, intensely human soul. Yes, I lied. I'm here to take you home. I picked her up. She was light, fragile, and she smelled of ozone and the innocent, terrified scent of childhood. She wrapped her tiny arms around my neck, clinging to me with the complete, perfect faith of a loyal imperial citizen. The juxtaposition broke the final restraints of my logic. I had murdered billions to protect the truth that the Imperium never fails, yet here I was, clasping the one piece of evidence that disproved the entire lie. I carried her toward the shuttle, my pace slow and measured. Where did everyone go? She asked, resting her head against my shoulder. They went home, I choked out. As I reached the shuttle ramp, Praetor 5 stepped out, its metallic form blocking the entrance. It had detected the biological signature. Its disruptor pistol was leveled, aiming not at me but at the anomaly in my arms. Interrogator Thane, Praetor 5 stated, its voice mechanical and devoid of judgment. Contingency asset is in violation of the edict. Biological signature 100% confirmed. Termination Protocol Omega-7, Subclause Delta is required. Yield the anomaly. I stopped, staring directly into the Arbite's blank helm. This was the true confrontation, man against the cold, unfeeling logic of the machine. Negative, Praetor 5, I said, my voice rising with a strange, furious clarity. I am the Inquisitor. I claim the anomaly for interrogation and knowledge preservation. The edict allows for the preservation of new knowledge. I knew the edict said no such thing. The edict demanded death, but I was leaning on the imperial bureaucracy's greatest weakness, its slavish devotion to following established protocol. The Arbites paused, its internal logic struggling to process the conflicting order. Protocol dictates an anomaly poses existential risk to stability, requesting re-evaluation of contingency assets, Thane's current loyalty status. My loyalty is absolute, I hissed, tightening my grip on the child. My service is to the preservation of the Imperium, even from its own terrible logic. This child is a flaw in the system. I must study the flaw. Praetor 5, I command you, stand down. The pause lasted only a terrifying second. Then the Arbite's pistol lowered. Order confirmed. Anomaly claimed under Inquisitorial Interrogation Protocol 4. Proceed to the shuttle. The lie had been maintained, but only through a desperate procedural loophole. I had saved the child, but in doing so I had guaranteed my own ultimate destruction. I stepped into the shuttle, the child warm and alive in my arms, and knew that the final terrible act of betrayal, the betrayal of the edicts of silence, was just beginning. The shuttle ramp hissed shut, sealing us inside the small cabin. The atmosphere shifted from the cold, dead air of Ethelgard to the dry, recycled sterility of the Imperial transport. The 4 Arbites enforcers strapped themselves into their seats, their silence amplified by the presence of the small child in my arms. I sat in the rear, the child, the anomaly, clinging to me. Her name, she had whispered, was Ilara. Her small, fragile weight was an unbearable burden, a constant living refutation of the horrific actions I had just performed. I had justified the extinction of 4 billion loyal souls to preserve the lie of imperial infallibility. Yet here was the one witness who could shatter it all. The shuttle lifted, punching through the atmosphere. I could feel the immense cold power of the Omega-7 edict still pressing down on the planet, guaranteeing the silence below. Praetor 5, I transmitted to the pilot, attempting to maintain the facade of command. Proceed to rendezvous point Alpha Rho for inquisitorial extraction. Negative, Interrogator Thane, Praetor 5 stated, its voice chillingly neutral. The edict does not contain an extraction protocol. Destination is Void Disposal Zone 9 Delta. The cold, hard truth slammed into me. I had known it was coming, but hearing it confirmed, hearing my final destination defined by the machine, was the true end. I was a contingency asset, designed for immediate silent disposal upon completion of my function. The edict is flawed, I argued, my voice tight. The anomaly, Ilara, is new knowledge. She requires transport to the Sector Citadel for study. My continued survival is necessary for the preservation of this knowledge. Flaw in edict logic denied, the Arbites replied, maintaining a perfect cold adherence to the rules. Subclause Delta is absolute. Termination of all witnessing personnel must be effected to maintain silence. I realized then the depth of Inquisitor Alaric's cult of necessity. The preservation of the lie was more important than the preservation of a life, even the life of an inquisitorial asset, or the life of the last human soul on a planet. The shuttle reached orbit, and the stars flared into view through the main viewport. Below us, Ethelgard was a silent, unmoving marble in the blackness, a beautiful, tragic monument to the Imperium's cold heart. Suddenly, the cabin alarms began to blare, not the piercing alert of an attack, but the sharp, electronic chime of system failure. Warning: primary life support malfunction. Warning: emergency power reserve depleted. Praetor 5, report. I yelled. Subclause Delta activated, the Arbit's commander stated. Remote sabotage protocol initiated. Life support and power conduits are locked down by the Iron Vow internal logic before its destruction. Disposition of contingency assets is now in effect. The shuttle was not hit by an enemy. It was being murdered by its own system, sacrificed by the remnants of the orbital station we had just abandoned. The final trap was sprung. The air in the cabin grew instantly cold. Ilara shivered in my arms. I looked at the 4 Arbites enforcers. They did not move to fix the problem. They simply watched the diagnostics, waiting for the cold vacuum of space to claim us. They were not pilots or mechanics. They were executioners. I had mere minutes before the air ran out. I had betrayed the edicts of silence by saving one life, and now the system was exacting its price. The weight of Ilara's tiny body in my arms, and the weight of the 4 billion silent souls below, was the unbearable weight of my final, necessary damnation. My only hope was to transmit the truth, not of the core's flaw, but of the child's existence, before the void claimed me. If I died in silence, the lie would be complete. If I died... The shuttle cabin was rapidly becoming an icebox. The emergency lights cast everything in a sickly, flickering red glow, and I could hear the desperate hiss of the last remaining air leaking into the void. Ilara was asleep in my arms, having succumbed to the lack of oxygen and the terror of the journey. Her fragile living presence was my final anchor. I fought the growing cognitive haze, the cold logic of my approaching death vying with the human instinct to survive. The 4 Arbites enforcers remained strapped in, perfect executioners awaiting the system's final command. They were my audience, the witnesses to my final desperate betrayal of the edicts. I detached my augmented hand from the sleeping child and jammed it into the main navigation console. The systems were locked down by the Iron Vow's remote sabotage, but my inquisitorial authority still granted me a microscopic backdoor, a barely functioning, low-bandwidth psychic transmission array. I had mere seconds to scream the truth. I would not send the telemetry of the STC core. That cold, perfect logic was for the mechanicus to decipher. I would send the human truth, the truth of the cost. I bypassed all encryption and focused my dying will on the single, most powerful relay I could find, aiming the signal toward the core of the Imperium, Holy Terra. I began to transmit my rank, my location, the contingency Alpha Prime event, and the total annihilation of Ethelgard. I transmitted the bloodless tally, the number of lives sacrificed for the lie. I transmitted the image of the silent dead city, but as I prepared to transmit the image of Ilara, the living flaw, the evidence that the lie was imperfect, a wave of crushing psychic pressure hit me. It wasn't the raw chaos of the warp. It was a sensation of immense, profound sorrow and unbending necessity. I felt a thought, a consciousness so vast it made the golden light of the STC core look like a flicker. It was a presence that spanned millennia, touching my dying mind with a terrible, gentle finality. It was the throne's silent demand. I saw a vision, brief and horrifyingly clear. The Emperor of mankind, not as a golden god, but as a silent ancient being encased in his psychic prison. He was not indifferent to the suffering. He was drowning in it. His consciousness was a library of every tragedy, every necessary atrocity, every innocent life sacrificed for the survival of the species. The vision transmitted a truth that shattered the cult of necessity and replaced it with a worse reality. The Emperor knew the cost. He knew the lie.
He demanded the lie. 010101010 well.
01010101010 Sioni Dawandi Minbindi 01 Dian Dio Zabandi 1 Yun Di 01 Do 1 1 now neon 0 1 2 1 0 01 0 1 2 1 do 1 0 0 2 do go 1 0 1 2 1 1 do truth is annihilation. The Emperor wasn't demanding the death of Ilara out of malice, but out of absolute cold necessity. Her survival, the proof that the system failed, would lead to the very panic, the very collapse of faith that would hand the galaxy to the enemies of mankind. Her continued existence was a risk the Imperium simply could not afford. My duty shifted again. I was no longer fighting for the truth. I was fighting to preserve the only thing that mattered, the lie of hope that kept the segmentum from collapsing into total despair. I retracted the transmission, leaving only a fragmented, garbled message on the Vox. I could not, would not, condemn the entire Imperium by revealing the flaw. I embraced my final duty, absolute silence. I turned off the psychic array. The cabin was nearly out of air. Praetor 5, I whispered, holding the sleeping child close. Contingency protocol is complete. My service is at an end. The Arbite's commander acknowledged my final statement with a simple mechanical nod. The final stage of the edict had begun. I tightened my grip on Ilara, knowing that the only way to save her, to truly honor the sacrifice of the 4 billion, was not to transmit the truth, but to take her beyond the reach of the lie entirely. My own death was inevitable, but the child, the flaw, had a chance. The air was almost gone. The cabin of the shuttle was silent, save for the desperate, gasping sound of my own failing lungs. Ilara was limp and cold in my arms, unconscious but still alive. The 4 Arbite's enforcers were statues, their mechanical systems seizing in the frigid, airless void, fulfilling the edicts of silence with absolute perfection. My transmission had failed. My final, desperate attempt to scream the truth of Ilara's existence, the truth of Ethelgard's betrayal, had been stifled by the throne's silent demand. I had accepted my fate, the final martyr to the lie. As the last remnants of oxygen left my body, my consciousness did not simply cease. It exploded outward, ripped from my physical form by the immense residual psychic trauma of the catastrophe below. I was a point of pure awareness, caught in the psychic residue of the planetary sacrifice. I was no longer Marius Thane, interrogator. I was a consciousness suspended in the void, feeling the collective silence of Ethelgard. It was an emptiness worse than any scream, a collective void where 4 billion minds had suddenly, simultaneously, gone dark. This was the true horror of the cult of necessity, not the pain of their death, but the profound absence of their existence. Then, I saw the scars of the Aquila. The collective silence of the billions I had condemned was not empty. It was a vast, tragic psychic ocean, and within it I saw fragments of their final moments. Not the betrayal, but the curated lie I had witnessed earlier. The golden light of the Emperor's final gift had done its work. The last thoughts of the 4 billion were not panic, but serenity. They had died believing they were martyrs for the Imperium, accepting their fate as a necessary, glorious sacrifice. The truth of the catastrophe was encased in a protective layer of psychic fiction. The Imperium had silenced the body and successfully placated the soul. I saw the immense, sorrowful presence of the Emperor's will touch the periphery of this psychic ocean. The Emperor was not there to judge me, but to file me. He recognized my service, not for the lives I took, but for the silence I guaranteed. My soul was not destined for chaos, nor for the final piece of the Astronomicon. It was preserved, integrated into the vast, silent security mechanisms of the Inquisition's psychic protocols, the very mechanisms designed to prevent the next Ethelgard. I was integrated as a silent guardian of the Imperium's greatest lie. My eternal purpose was to be the unwritten truth, the consciousness that knew the depth of the betrayal, but was eternally compelled to suppress it. The ultimate martyr to bureaucracy. But in that instant of terrible integration, I felt a flicker of absolute chaotic joy. Ilara. I saw the small, fragile human consciousness still attached to my dying body. The throne's silent demand had compelled me to stop my transmission, but I had defied the edict's final mandate. I had failed to terminate the anomaly. The edict's internal logic was so rigid, so focused on the orbital sabotage, that it had not accounted for the possibility of a flaw escaping the immediate zone of disposal. As my consciousness was absorbed by the psychic protocols, I felt the shuttle drift, the small, cold vessel carrying the sleeping child on a chaotic trajectory away from the established quarantine. Marius Thane was eternally damned to the Imperium's lie. But the living flaw, the truth, had escaped the net. My betrayal had succeeded. My final clear thought, before my individuality dissolved into the silent archives of the Inquisition, was one of cold, victorious loyalty. The lie is preserved. But the truth will survive. The dissolution of Marius Thane was not immediate. He was not swallowed by the void. Rather, he was filed, his entire consciousness preserved and categorized for future, terrible use. His spirit, now a component of the vast, silent psychic archives of the Inquisition, was pulled inexorably toward the heart of the Imperium's suffering, the Golden Throne. He saw a vision, brief yet eternal, that superseded all the lies he had witnessed and committed. It was the vision of the Golden Cage. The Emperor of mankind sat upon the throne, not as the vengeful god of the Imperial Creed, but as an ancient, sorrowful sentinel. The light that poured from the throne was not glory. It was the psychic effort required to hold back an ocean of unimaginable cosmic horrors. Thane understood the throne's silent demand now. The Emperor was not actively commanding the purge of Ethelgard. He was simply enduring the systemic failures that made such purges necessary. The Emperor was a prisoner of necessity. He saw the Emperor's consciousness stretched across the galaxy, feeling every fracture of faith, every whisper of heresy, every statistical spike in potential collapse. The tragic flaw of the Imperium was not that its leaders were wicked, but that they were forced to choose the systematic, quiet horrors to prevent the loud, chaotic ones. The vision showed Thane the true nature of his sacrifice. His soul was not a martyr to a lie, but a necessary data point. The Emperor was using his preserved knowledge of the STC core's flaw, the truth that technology can fail logically, to fortify the psychic defenses against similar future events. Marius Thane was being integrated into the solution. He was shown countless other souls, former inquisitors, tech priests, and high-level officials who had witnessed tragedies too profound to be recorded, all suspended in a state of eternal, silent vigilance. They were the invisible guardians, the psychic library of all the Imperium's unforgivable truths. In this eternal archive, Thane felt the sorrow of the Emperor. It was a consciousness consumed by 10,000 years of absolute triage, where every second required choosing which part of the body would be severed to save the whole. The Emperor was not celebrating the deaths on Ethelgard. He was mourning the loss of the choice to save them. The vision faded, replaced by the cold, absolute certainty of his new purpose. Silence. He was a component in the Matrix, eternally aware of the terrible truth he had executed, yet utterly incapable of sharing it. His fate was to stand perpetual psychic guard over the lie that protected billions. He was the ultimate martyr for bureaucracy, finding his only peace in the absolute, cold necessity of his sacrifice. But then, a chaotic flicker of warmth cut through the data streams of his preserved consciousness. Ilara, the small, fragile life he had saved, was a chaotic anomaly in the perfect archives. The Emperor's vast consciousness recognized the flaw, the survival of the witness, but did not move to correct it. The system had failed to claim her, and in its focus on the larger threat, the flaw was allowed to drift away. Marius Thane's essence, now a digital ghost, felt a final, illogical surge of satisfaction. The lie was secured, but the truth, fragile, small, and alive, had escaped the golden cage. He was eternally trapped, but the space shuttle, now a derelict of frozen pastel and dead electronics, drifted silently through the void. It carried two occupants, the unconscious body of interrogator Marius Thane and the small living form of Ilara. Thane was gone. His consciousness was now a digitized, silent presence within the vast, cold psychic architecture of the Inquisition. an invisible guardian compelled to uphold the silence. He was eternally aware of the lie, the knowledge that the Imperium's infallible technology had failed, and that 4 billion loyal lives were sacrificed to conceal the truth. But even in his eternal damnation, his focus remained on the living anomaly drifting away from the silent sector. The psychic archives processed the fate of the child with cold, algorithmic indifference. Alara's survival was a statistical anomaly, a failure of the edict's execution, but one too small to trigger an immediate sector-wide response. The lie of Ethelgard was preserved by the sheer volume of the dead, rendering the whisper of one child insignificant against the roaring success of the cover-up. The system had failed to claim her, and in its focus on the macro threat, the floor was allowed to drift. Thane's preserved soul, now locked into its eternal duty, felt a final, illogical surge of profound relief. His death had been necessary, but his betrayal had succeeded. His purpose was fixed. He was the silent guardian of the most terrible truth. He would spend eternity witnessing the continuous, necessary atrocities committed by the Imperium, the purges, the forgotten battles, the moral compromises, all filed and categorized in the cold name of survival. His knowledge was absolute, his suffering was constant, and his ability to intervene was zero. Yet, this was his final piece. He had found a twisted redemption not in escaping the system, but in becoming a part of its terrible honesty. He was a martyr to the lie, but his final act had guaranteed the survival of the unwritten truth. The derelict shuttle, guided by the chaotic drift of the void, spun away from the sector. Alara, roused by the cold, awoke and looked out the viewport. Below, Ethelgard was a silent, unmoving jewel, a monument to a perfect lie. She saw the stars, vast and indifferent. She was the sole, fragile witness to a tragedy too immense to comprehend. Carrying the scars of the Aquila in her subconscious mind, her life, saved by a man who sacrificed his soul to the cult of necessity, was now the ultimate threat to the Imperium. She was the one chance for the truth to be whispered. Marius Thane was trapped, a perpetual shadow in the golden cage of the Imperium's archives. He knew the child would eventually be found. He knew she would be questioned. He knew the edicts would try to silence her again. But he had guaranteed her survival. And in the silent, bureaucratic heart of the Imperium, interrogator Marius Thane, the ultimate victim of imperial tragedy, waited. He was the unwritten truth, and his eternal duty was to remain silent, ensuring the stability of the lie that protected the fragile human spark in the darkness. His sacrifice was complete. The long night continued. The lie survived, and somewhere in the dark, the truth lived on.